Take your Bibles, if you would, please, and turn to Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8. We have a few more weeks left in our book of Proverbs topical study. The plan then, after the first of the year, is to move into the Gospel of John. We are going to be approaching the next study in a different fashion. We will be doing verse by verse and line by line, but also we're going to tie all three services, January through May, into the study of the Gospel of John, giving continuity to all three services and magnifying the significance of all three as we deal with the Gospel of John, Lord willing, starting the first of next month. But tonight, we're talking about leadership wisdom. Wisdom when it comes to leadership. You know, there is a level of loneliness that is associated with every level of leadership. Do you realize that? There is a level of loneliness that is associated with every level of leadership. If you're the parent, you know, there's a bit of a loneliness there between you and your children. There's going to be so much camaraderie because at the end of the day, you're the leader, okay? And you've got to make sometimes decisions. And there's a level of loneliness in all kinds of leadership, in all levels of leadership. And that loneliness can sometimes create a space where wrong thinking can develop. You've seen this with politicians. You've seen it with other leaders in religion and even among Christians, sometimes coming up and thinking inappropriately in the area of leadership. Now, I want to start with two things. First of all, these first three observations are simply observations about life that I think are worth noting. And if you're going to be a wise leader or be able to ascertain if you have wise leadership around you or ahead of you, you need to keep these three things in mind. So we'll start with the first part. Just keep in mind these three things. Number one, obedience to God is always the wise thing to do, regardless of the cost. Now, I want you to think that through sometimes, because sometimes obedience to God can cost you as a leader quite significantly. But you have to ask yourself the question, if I'm obedient to God, regardless of what the cost is, I simply need to be obedient for obedience sake. Now, sometimes we in leadership can miss that, because if you're a leader, you're responsible for whatever you're leading, which means you're responsible for not only the present thing you're leading, but the future of what you're leading. Whether you're leading your marriage, your family, your children, your business, the church, whatever you're leading, okay? And yet, the danger is you can start saying, well, if I do what God told me to do here, this is what's going to happen to the people I'm leading. And so since I can't really reconcile wanting that to happen, I don't lead properly. So obedience to God must come regardless of the cost. But the second thing is this: wisdom demands obedience, but does not end with obedience. And you must understand that if you're a leader. You must understand that obedience, it starts with obedience. Because, remember this, we've talked about this before, just because something isn't wrong, it doesn't mean that it's right. Now, pause that for a second. Just because it's not wrong, doesn't mean it's right. In other words, it may be not wrong to do generically, but it's wrong for you to do it because it is not God's will for your life. Romans chapter 14 is clear about that, and 1 Corinthians 6 says, if it's not right, if God's not God's will, it's not right. Even though it's not wrong for anybody else to do it, I shouldn't do it because it's not God's will, okay? Now, both of these points are really important, okay? Because we have to understand that I cannot simply say, well, I'm doing what is right, so I'm right. No, it may not be right. Because there may be some other factors at play requiring you to do something, of course, not something wrong, but a different choice Because many times in our lives, we have multiple right choices to choose from. And we have to keep that in mind. Number 3, leaders must be decisive without being impulsive. If you ever known a decisive leader that was impulsive, then you know how to get a headache just trying to listen to him. I remember one of the jobs I had working my way through Bible college was working at an auto parts warehouse. Now you have to understand my level of automotive understanding today, many years later, is very minute. If you ever see me open the hood on a car, you know it's simply for show. There is no real practical reason for me opening the hood, other than maybe checking the fluid levels. I can do some of that, okay? But other than, if I'm opening the hood for any other reason, simply to check maybe the oil or whatever like that, it is, or to put stuff in for the windshield, stuff like that. Other than that, if you ever see me with the hood up and a tool in my hand, other than a sledgehammer, then you know that really it is simply for show. Because I have no concept of what's under the hood. The way I diagnose the car is, if you turn it, it doesn't start, it's broken. If you drive it and it shakes and shimmers, then it's not working right. And that's the extent of my ability to actually diagnose anything. But back then, I was in an auto parts warehouse, and we had this boss that was decisive, but he was impulsive. Now, he was the boss because he had married the owner's daughter. And he didn't know much more about cars, I think, than I did. But his impulsiveness created a constant air of unsettledness among the staff because he was all over the board all the time, okay? So those 3 things to keep in mind. Obedience to God is always the wise thing to do, regardless of the cost. But second, wisdom demands obedience, but does not end with obedience. If I'm going to be wise, I have to say, not only is this the right thing to do, but is it the right thing to do now? And is it the right way to do it now? And so forth it goes, okay? Now, the starting point for us is going to be in Proverbs chapter 8. And look at verse 15. We're going to be in chapter 31 for most of our comments tonight, but let's begin in Proverbs chapter 8. We'll look at verse 18. By me, kings reign, and princesses decree justice. Now, I want to give you 3 things to understand, okay? First of all, number 1, starting point. Leaders lead by the authority of God. Leaders lead by the authority of God. Romans chapter 13, the powers that be are ordained of God, okay? And so leaders lead lead by the authority of God. Now, it's not an open-ended ticket, okay? Not an open-ended authority, okay? Because when we violate God's will and violate the law, then in fact that authority dissipates. Thus, that's why the apostles could say, I must obey God rather than man. When man's laws conflict with God's law, then God's law has to supersede it, okay? But the position of a human authority rests in what God, look at verse 15, by me kings reign. Now, Proverbs 21:1 says this, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he will. Okay? That God, in fact, is in charge of that. Now, sometimes we like that, and we can say, yes, I can see, well, that's a good leader. And sometimes we can't. Is that true? Okay? It's true in life, in politics, in business. One of the important things for our children to understand in their training is that they need to be respectful to their parents and to their teachers, because in a very short number of years, particularly in junior high and senior high, they're going to wind up in the workplace, right? And what happens to most people in the workplace when they get mad at their bosses or their supervisors and they start persistently disagreeing with them and resisting them and don't obey them? What is that usually called? Unemployment. Exactly. Okay? And so you have to understand that. And so we have to teach them to understand that the authority, that those who lead by the authority of God. But second, leaders are to lead by example. The second half of this verse says, the princes decree justice. The word decree there is not just the idea of speaking it, but the word decree means dwelling place or to be cut into a groove. And the idea is that the princess, those in leadership, live within the groove of righteousness. In other words, justice, the word justice means what is right, what is just, what is moral. It has the idea of weights and measurements. The idea here is that a leader leads by example. What's the old saying? I can't hear what you're saying because I see what you're doing, right? Or what you do speaks so loud, I can't hear what you're saying. And that is so true, is it not? The example of leadership is a challenging and a humble thing. Lord willing, Sunday, either Sunday morning or Sunday night, the verdict's still out of when this message, I got 2 messages already for Sunday, but we're not sure which one we're doing when. But one of them, Lord willing, is going to be from Acts chapter 20. Sunday morning, we're talking about dealing with differences. And one of the services is dealing with differences. The other is preparing for differences. But in the preparing for differences from Acts chapter 20, we talk about the importance of leaders being held accountable. And leadership in all of our lives needs to be held accountable, okay? Look at Proverbs 29, verse 4 says this, by justice a king builds up the land, but he who exacts gifts tears it down. Proverbs 16:12 says, it is an abomination to kings to commit wickedness, for the throne is established by righteousness. Now, what is true about kings is true about church leaders, it's true about business leaders. It's true about all of us in leadership, whatever realm of leadership, if we're a parent, if we're a grandparent, whatever kind of leadership role God gives us, that we have to lead by example, okay? So I've got to make sure that I'm understanding this. And by the way, I must be willing as a leader, okay, to hold myself accountable, but I also must be willing to hold other people accountable. I talked to one of the men that we're praying about having as a deacon for next year. Would be a new deacon for our church family if it occurs, and as the Lord leads. And I was sharing what do deacons do, and I said, well, you know, a deacon does many things, but one of the deacons do is they do hold the pastor accountable because people in leadership who are not held accountable are in trouble. We all need it. All of us in leadership need it. Whatever leadership responsibility, you need somebody around you that can see your blind spots, because we all have them, do we not? Don't you? You have blind spots. You say, what are they? Well, you can't see them, but you have them, because we all have them, okay? A while back, there was a blind spot about me, and somebody pointed out to me, and they were very kind about it. They were very clear about it, but they were very kind about it. And it's helped me the last 3 or 4 months. It's been quite helpful to me, okay? You say, well, what was it? Well, none of your business. If you haven't seen it, I'm not going to point it out to you. Okay, but I've been working on it since they pointed it out to me, and it was very helpful, but we all have them. The fact that you're a leader and has blind spots, it's just true for all of us. But we need to be held accountable. But we need to be held ourselves accountable, and we need to be willing for other people to hold us accountable also. So we lead by example. Now, with all of that said, let's turn to Proverbs 31, okay? With that laying the groundwork here, that obedience to God is always the wise thing to do regardless of the cost. The wisdom demands obedience, but does not end with obedience. And leaders must be decisive without being impulsive all over the board. With that in mind, and starting with the fact that leaders lead by the authority of God and leaders lead by example, we now come to Proverbs chapter 31. And in Proverbs 31, in verses 1 through 9, we dealt with the virtuous woman here a number of weeks ago, I believe it was. But here we talk about King Lemuel, okay? And King Lemuel here in this passage is a character of great or somewhat some mystery in the Scripture, okay? Who is he? Does anybody know who he is? Anybody know for sure who he is? Well, nobody else knows exactly for sure who he is, okay? There are three theories. Let me give you the three theories to you, okay? Does anybody know who the theories are? Anybody know? Solomon is one of them. Yes, yes. You win a free glass of water, young lady. Yes, yes, yes. Some people think that maybe it's Solomon, and maybe it's a nickname that his mother gave him, and that means his mother would have been whom? Bathsheba, right? That's one possibility. Okay. The other is that it's King Hezekiah. I'm not sure where that comes from, but that is one of the theories. And the other is that it's simply a word picture created by Solomon, which doesn't really make any sense to me why they would say that, but that's what people say, okay? So the fact is, I'm not sure who he is, but we do know he was a king in this, and he had a pretty smart mom, okay? So verse 1, let's read it and we'll talk about it. There are three principles about leadership that we get from this passage. So let's read the passage, then we'll give you the three principles, and we'll talk about each of them as we have time. Chapter 31 and verse 1. The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. So this is what he got from his mom. You know, moms are pretty smart people, aren't they? I know my mother gave me some of the greatest bits of advice my mother ever gave me, and probably prepared me for ministry more than anything else. Any singular two bits of words of advice was one, she said, Tony, when you preach, don't get in God's way. And I've always remembered that. I would like to think that I've always done that, but I'm sure I have not. I'm sure I've gotten in God's way in preaching and teaching sometimes and going off my own little rabbit trail, but I don't like to do that. And so I'm conscious of that. And the other thing she said is, to me, she says, you know, I don't trust you. And I appreciated that. You say, well, what context did she say that? Did you have her, you know, I did go through a time in third grade, when I was in third grade for the second time, where I did steal some of her Winstons, because they used to say that Winston's taste good like a cigarette should. But I will tell you, if you've ever heard that phrase, that is not true. Cigarettes are awful things. They just stink, stank, and stunk. Okay, but be that as it may, that wasn't the issue. The issue was, it was Karen and I were dating in high school. And then she would put these restrictions on me, and she would say, I would say, well, don't you trust me? And she would say, of course not. You're a teenage boy. What do you think? You think, do I look stupid? You know? So a lot of good advice there, right? Okay, both those. But we won't, okay, but anyhow, we'll move on. Verse 2. What, my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows, give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more. Open thy mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. These are 8 verses that are filled with enormous truths to all of us who are in leadership position. And all of us who are under leadership position, and by the way, we all are under some leadership position. None of us are by ourselves. We should be challenged to understand how to pray for our leaders and what to look for in leaders. So 3 things, okay? 3 things from this passage I want to give you, okay? Number 1, leadership demands control. Second, leadership demands compassion. That's point 2. And point 3, leadership demands courage. So all 3 of these come: control, compassion, and courage. And we need this, okay? We do, okay? Now, in verses 1 to 5, he talks about the control that a leader must have, okay? Now, there's 3 of them. I'll give these. You can write these down if you want to, then we'll talk about them if that's okay. So letter A, you have to accept your position. Letter B, you got to protect your responsibilities. And number C, you got to resist the loss of control, okay? There you go. Or resist the use of alcohol. I thought I changed that, and I did. Resist the use of alcohol, which originally was loss of control, but that goes right to the point. That's what he talks about. If you're in leadership, you shouldn't drink. That's what it says. You say, well, I don't agree with that. Well, take it up with God. It's right here in the scripture, okay? So look at verse 3. Give not thy strength unto women. Now, who is the wisest man who ever lived other than Jesus? Solomon. How many wives did Solomon have? And how many did he have on the B team? 300. That's 1,000 women. Now, I'm just telling you, that's a lot of ladies, okay? Now, Solomon begins his life, his reign, where God says to him, what do you want? And what does Solomon not say that he wants from God? Wealth. And what else? What does he not say? That you think a king might want? Wealth, power, military superiority. What does he ask for? Wisdom. Awesome. Isn't that wonderful? He didn't ask to be successful. He asked to be wise. Would to God his tribe increase in my own heart sometimes. I would ask more for wisdom. That's my way to be done. Or things to work out the way I want. God, give me wisdom because I don't know what to do. Okay? Am I alone in that? I don't think so. Okay? But as he gets older, his wives and concubines have a significant influence upon him. What do they do? What kind of influence does the Bible reveal that they had on him when it came to his walk with God? They drew him to other gods. Okay? So the idea of when it says, give not thy strength unto women, he's saying to him, accept your position and don't give it to somebody else. Don't give the wheel to somebody else. You're responsible. So not everybody likes what I'm trying to do as a leader. Well, of course they don't. What did you expect? You know? People don't like everything I do. And I don't know anybody that I agree on everything they do. So, you know what I'm saying? I mean, don't tell my wife, but, there's a couple of things maybe that she doesn't actually agree with. I don't know. Oh, she's here. Okay, I'm just kidding. But isn't that true for all of us? Isn't it true for all of us that none of us do everything that the other people around us wish we would do? And sometimes those wishes are legitimate, but sometimes they're not. They're simply just differences of opinion, and you're doing it the way you feel like God would have you to do it. And what he's saying here is don't abdicate your responsibility, okay? If you're the leader, then lead. That's your job. That's my job. That's your job. And so I've got to lead. But not lead irrationally, not lead abusively. Of course not. But I've got to accept my position. And then second, I've got to protect my responsibility. Look what it says here. Nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. Okay? In other words, that's the protect my responsibility. Don't do that which is going to destroy your kingdom. But thirdly, I've got to resist the use of alcohol. Look at what it says. It is, and this, by the way, is tied into the whole idea of destroying your kingdom to point C. So point B and C are inseparably connected, but I make it a distinction simply because we need to protect our responsibility. We can destroy ourselves other than just through alcohol. But he goes in verses 4 and 5 and specifically mentions alcohol. I know nobody whose life is ever any improved at all by the use of alcohol, okay? That's why we make sure I tell our pastors and our deacons no alcohol. Why? Because it is just not good stuff, okay? Look what it says here. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes to strong drink. He's not saying a little dab would do you. He's not saying be a social drinker. Now, why is that? Well, look at the next verse. Lest they drink. Now, watch this. And there are two things that happen with alcohol. First of all, you forget what you need to remember. People forget. I see it all the time. Growing up, I saw it all the time. I used to tend bar before I became a Christian. When I was like 10, 11, and 12, right before I was 12 years old. I used to tend bar at my parents' house. And I could fix the mixed drinks quite well. I was quite efficient, by the way. I was quite an accomplished bartender for an 11-year-old, okay? Nothing fancy, mind you, but I could mix the stuff up, okay? And what I discovered at a very young age, that one drink of alcohol began the metamorphosis. You say, well, I can handle my alcohol. Well, you're just an idiot. I'm sorry. You can't handle your alcohol. Nobody can stop it from affecting their body and their mind, okay? What happens is they start forgetting themselves, okay? Then, the second thing that happens with alcohol, not only do you forget yourself, but then it says, judgment, you pervert the judgment. You then misjudge things. Because you forget certain things, you misjudge certain things. And how many times have you heard of people who have died because people got drunk and drove their car, did other foolish things? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the damage takes place where I know, for example, I have people I've known over the years who cannot relax without drinking. They have to drink to unwind. Now, what they don't understand is that alcohol is a depressant. It depresses you. It depresses you and it distorts you. And so as a leader, look at Proverbs 20, verse 1 says, wine is a mocker and strong drink raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Proverbs 21:17 says, he that loveth pleasure shall be poor. He that loveth wine and oil shall not be rich. If you want to give away your money, then start drinking alcohol. Okay? Number 2, leadership demands compassion. Look at verse 6. There are two things here. First of all, to be merciful to those who are in need. I'll give them to you, then we'll talk about them. And then righteous in your response to sin. Okay? So, the first one, I need to be merciful in response to the need. Look at verse 6. Give strong weak unto him to drink, to him that is ready to perish. Now, what he's talking about, he's not contradicting what he said about the king not drinking. He's saying, look, when you drink, okay, you wind up distancing yourself from reality. And if you've ever been at the bedside of a dying person, particularly the hospice or other situations, you know that one of the things they try to do is try to manage the pain, because there's no real value in worrying about a person who's got days to live. Are they going to get addicted to this pain medicine? Well, what's the point here? Okay, and that's what he's saying here. He's saying, be merciful in your response to those in need. Okay? If that's what they need, take a little wine for your stomach's sake kind of thing, but this is like at the end of life. Okay? The idea there is that you do that. Giving wine to those who be of a heavy heart is referring to those who are depressed and despondent. Okay? That's certainly true. But again, it requires a level of mercy because they did not have other sources of treatment. But second of all, a response to sin. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his misery no more. So the idea here is that you're trying to be merciful, but also righteous in your response to sin, because you're not taking verses 6 and 7 and discounting and using these methods used at exceptional time to those in need, okay, as a way of life, thus eclipsing your ability to handle life correctly. In Proverbs chapter, I think it's 20. Let's look at Proverbs 20 for a second. Proverbs 20, and it says in verse 28, mercy and truth preserveth the king, and his throne is upheld by mercy. We ought to be merciful to those around us, okay? And look at verse 8, okay, of the same chapter 20. A king that sitteth in the throne of judgment scattereth away all evil with his eyes. In other words, he is righteous. He is seeing things clearly, and he is responding in righteousness. And then finally, leadership demands courage in verses 8 and 9, okay? In verses 8 and 9, he talks about the courage of a leader to do two things. First of all, in being discerning in judgment. And second of all, being selective in actions. A leader is required to be discerning. He's got to think things through. He can't just go be impulsive. He's got to think things through, okay? Open thy mouth for the dumb, those who can't speak, in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Okay? So, in other words, you got to be willing to discern and then act accordingly. Okay? Look at Proverbs 25. Okay? When it comes to discernment, look at Proverbs 25, and let's look at verse 1. We're going to read through verses 1 through 5 here. Okay? Proverbs 25 and verse 1. These are also Proverbs of Solomon, which the man of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. Verse 2. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. The heaven for height, and the earth for depth, and the heart of a king is unsearchable. Take away the dross from the silver, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. The idea here he's speaking of is talking about being discerning. God conceals things in the mystery of his glory, but a king, in verse 2, has to search out a matter. He's got to be discerning in judgment. So he's got to think, okay, now, wait a minute, if I do this, what are the consequences? If I make that choice, what are the consequences? If I make this choice, what are the consequences? Now, all of us, can we not, who have lived long enough, can look back at our lives and say, I can see where I've made some really wise, discerning moves that were the right choice in difficult times, and to God be the glory, it worked out very well. But if we're honest, can we also acknowledge that there are times where we weren't as discerning, where we made unwise choices, not thinking it through clearly? Now, it is true that all of us have made both kinds of choices, probably. Okay? Certainly, we've all made the wrong choices, but hopefully, we've also made some right choices. But it should require us to be discerning. Now, what do you mean? What does it mean to discern? You might want to write this down. It means you see things as they are, but you also see things how they ought to be. Not only how things are, but how they ought to be. And you not only see your choices, but you see the consequences of your choices. I just finished this week Barack Obama's recent book on his presidency, which I didn't realize only went through like 2/3 of his first term, but the guy is wordy. Okay, and but it's a really wordy book. But in it, I've read biographies of probably over half the presidents of the United States, and he affirmed what I've heard other presidents say, and that is this: by the time a decision gets to him at his level, there's no clear answer. If it was a simple decision, it would have been made downstream. The president only gets choices where there are trade-offs and possibilities. So when they think of a choice, like do you go after the compound and try to get Obama, not Obama, Bin Laden, thank you, Bin Laden. Do you go in there, or do you blow it up, or what do you do? And so he talked through how you did it. And when they went around talking to the room, they said, well, Hillary said to him, well, it's a 51-49 choice between these two choices. And he had to make a choice. But that's how it is for all presidents that make any significant choices like that, okay? Now, we're not presidents of the United States, but we're president of our own lives, you know, or of our families. And we have to make decisions all the time, but there's no clear direction. Most of the decisions I make every day, and so do you, are not based on biblical absolutes. They're based upon applying biblical truths. And so I've got to be given to discernment, to thinking it through and asking myself, what are my options? If I do this, what about that? If I do that, what about the other? Okay? And weigh it out and make the right choice. Discerning. But second, I got to be selective. Look back at our text, okay? Open thy mouth and judge righteously and plead the cause of the poor and needy. I can't plead every case. Proverbs 29:4 says, the king by judgment established the land, but he that receiveth gifts overthrow it. I established the kingdom by my judgment righteously, but he's got to be selective, because a leader can't do everything about everything. Because if he does, he becomes manipulative and controlling, or he or she, and becomes a real pain to deal with, and is going to make wrong choices. Okay? So a leader has got to be discerning, but then selective when he or she acts according to God's leadership in their life. Okay? Now when I went through this week, my heart was encouraged. A book that Pastor Travis and I are working through. We meet once a week. We're working on different books to go through. We're going through a book on leadership right now. So once a week we meet for time of discipleship and talking and mentoring and so forth on Tuesdays, and challenging ourselves to think about being the leader God wants us to be. Now, I want to encourage you tonight, whether you're listening online or here, to be the leader God would have you to be. Whatever arena that you may have. You say, well, it may be an official position or an unofficial position. There are peoples to whom they look to you, whether you're in an official position or not. And for many of us, we have official positions. Us men, we have official positions. Many of us, we're married, we have it. And they're looking to us to be what we'd have what it is to be. So let's follow the parameters here in our church, in our homes, in our lives.